Okay, tape starting. Both cameras. Okay. This is... Mr. President, how are the plans for the library progressing?
Progressing very, very well. We are within sight of the financial goal which we've been trying to reach. The building is 77% completed, and the building itself will be entirely completed sometime toward the last of April. And we hope to have a dedication ceremony that will be one that will set a precedent on about the 8th of May, 1957, which is a day on which I'll pass another milestone. Well, I wouldn't say that I did it myself.
Mr. President, during your years in the Senate, what was the most difficult vote you had to cast? The one that troubled you most?
Well, that's hard to say. I was always in the bandwagon with those who believed that the Democratic platforms of 1932, 36, 40, and 44 were good platforms and they ought to be implemented. There were times always when it's difficult to vote for the simple reason that it's difficult for an ordinary senator, unless he's on the committee, to get all the facts. It's necessary for him to read so many documents that he can't get all the facts on everything that comes up. I think one of the most difficult votes that I had to cast was to stay put and vote for the increase in the number of judges on the Supreme Court of the United States, and I was one of 7 senators that stayed put.
You say in your book, Mr. President, that about 30 or 40 senators really worked very hard and industriously.
That's
Another 10 or 15 fairly hard, and the rest sort of coast.
That's true.
Would you feel that that percentage still holds?
Well, of course, I can't tell, not being in the Senate. When I was there, I knew exactly what I was talking about, and I was making the conversation at that time on the facts as I knew them when I was there. I don't know how many hard workers there are in the Senate at this time, and they'd be 96 of them, for all I know.
I suppose more than any previous president, you had command of the budget in terms of understanding it and certainly explaining it to reporters.
Well, that came about in this way. When I first went to the Senate, I was assigned to the Appropriations Committee as well as the Interstate Commerce Committee, both very important committees. And I was always present when the Appropriations Committee met, and I was on several of its subcommittees. And I was familiar with all the budgets that were sent down to the Congress of the United States because I had to listen to the justification for the budget allowances in the various departments. So I had a hand in 10 budgets while I was in the Senate, and I made 8 budgets myself while I was President of the United States, and I knew every figure in them. As you remember, when you used to come down to the budget seminar and try to put the President on the spot by asking questions about certain figures, you always got the answers because I knew where they were, and sometimes I succeeded in tangling up you fellas much more than you did me.
You certainly did. Do you have any feeling at all that the director of the budget, in normal circumstances, operates too much in a vacuum, so to speak, without direct control from the executive branch?
The director of the budget is an arm of the President of the United States who's responsible for the budget. The President of the United States has to tell the budget director what he can do and what he can't do. He's there for that purpose, and they're very efficient people. I had some of the finest men in the government in the Budget Bureau of the United States, and the Budget Bureau is efficient and is all right, but they have to have direction from the chief executive if they're going to do a job as it ought to be done.
It's rather unusual in this country, isn't it, that the government really doesn't control its own finances, that the Federal Reserve Board has much more control over the financial situation than occurs in other countries?
I don't think that's true. The Secretary of the Treasury is the financial controller of the United States of America. And you'll always find that the Federal Reserve Board, when the Secretary of the Treasury and the President of the United States know exactly what they want, they'll give it to him. The financial control of the government of the United States and the service of the national debt of the United States is in the hands of the Secretary of the Treasury and nobody else. and the president tells him how he wants that direction done. Nobody can tell him but the president.
Now, this raises another question that is interesting very much. What do you regard as the ideal relationship between the president and the members of his cabinet?
Well, it's a matter of cooperation. The president has those men around him because that's his duty as the chief executive of the United States to run every one of those departments. He has to have men who are in sympathy with the policy that he wants to pursue. He consults those men 2 or 3 times a week and sometimes oftener if it's necessary. But when it comes to the final decision, if all the cabinet vote one way, the president says this is it and it's the other way, they have to take it and like it and do it.
That's what Mr. Jackson did in a sense, didn't he?
Abraham Lincoln, when he had the Emancipation Proclamation up, had all the cabinet voting no, and he said the ayes have it and you go ahead with it.
Well, I believe, I know that you believe in the vice president being fully informed and briefed on all affairs of state.
I certainly do. I always had the vice president or the president pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House, the floor leaders of the the 2 parties, whenever an important matter came up, they were all briefed in my office by the President of the United States, and their advice was sought. The Vice President was as familiar with what went on in the executive branch of the government as I was when I was President and Senator Barkley was Vice President of the United States.
Then, no matter how many experts the President may call in to give him counsel and guidance, or what recommendations he may get from his cabinet members, the final and ultimate responsibility is his and no one else.
That's correct.
Council tend to bring all of his counsel and advice more into one fist, so to speak, than it had been before?
That was the objective. When the war came on, President Roosevelt had started on a reorganization of the executive branch of the government so that he could have his hand on more information. And he didn't quite get through with it because the war came along before he got a good start on it. But when I took over, information came from every department in the government in a messed up manner. Sometimes a stack of messages that high would come in one day. Well, in order to get those things coordinated and to find out the duplicates in that great pile of papers, I had the Central Intelligence Agency organized. Admiral Leahy and Admiral Sowers were the moving spirits in the organization of that Central Intelligence Agency, and it's a great asset to the President because they can present him with information all around the world and at home also because it coordinates every executive department. All the members of the cabinet have access to that intelligence agency for their own benefit and for the welfare of the country. It's a wonderful thing, and if properly handled, it'll be one of the greatest assets the President has.
Do you think the CIA should be subjected to closer congressional scrutiny than it is?
I don't think the Congress has any business dabbling in it because when the Central Intelligence Agency places these secret documents before the President, they're for his information so he can decide what should be told to the Congress on that subject. Now, the Central Intelligence Agency, of course, has to be supported by appropriations. And the Central Intelligence Director has always had the direction for me to tell the Congress as much as he could about the operation of the department. But they had no right to have access to the messages which came for the eyes of the President only.
Mr. President, do you remember clearly the first 48 hours after you became President?
Yes, I'll never forget it, of course.
You say in your book that when you left Sam Rayburn's office to go to the White House, you escaped your darkness for the first and only time.
Well, it came about in this way. There was a lot of pending legislation in which the President was very much interested. And Sam Rayburn and I used to have conferences on it after the 2 houses adjourned. Sometimes he'd come over to the Vice President's office, and sometimes Yes, I was. Yes, I was, because I had been assured in October by the commanding general of the Far East of the United States forces that they would not do it.
Have not the general been advised twice by the Indian representative in Beiping that if we reached for the Yalu, the Chinese would come in?
I don't know. I don't know for sure about that because I've never read those documents that were in his file.
did you fail to do as president that you would like to have done most? For professionals in politics and in other fields of a successful, good politician.
Well, the fundamental basis of a good politician is that he must be an honorable man. And I mean that in its broadest sense. He must be a man of high principle. He must be a man who is willing to keep his word if it hurts him. And he's a man who must understand people and like people and be willing to get along with them. And he ought to have experience from the precinct all the way up. I claim that I've had experience from precinct.
When they were in trouble. Is that part of the qualifications?
That's part of the qualifications of a good government operator or a good politician, for the simple reason that a man who understands people and knows how to get along with people is bound to make friends. And that's what puts him up in politics. His friends put him up by having confidence in him that he'll do the right thing. And when his friends get into trouble is when they need a friend. When a man's on top, he doesn't need any friends, but when a man's in trouble, he wants somebody that'll sympathize with him and help him to get out. And I have no admiration for a man who runs out on his friends when they get into trouble.
Mr. President, could we go back to Stalin for a moment?
Yes.
You told Stalin, was it done partly as a result of a miscalculation of the military?
If you remember the history of the invention of the field artillery, the first field artillerymen who fired in Italy with a big gun were taken out and hanged after the peace was attained. And a weapon of war is...
Our intelligence may not have been quite adequate on the Japanese position because the resistance would not have been as considerable as our estimates indicated.
Well, there's one thing I can say to you, that any schoolboy's hindsight's worth all a president's or a general's foresight. I had that brought home to me very strongly when we were discussing one time in a class in history in high school the Battle of Gettysburg. And one young man got up and said if Lee had done this and that and the other thing, this thing would have come out another way. The old man who was the professor with chin whiskers and a very salty old gentleman said, well, young man, don't you know that any schoolboy's afterthought's worth more than all the general's forethought? So afterthoughts and things after the fact have no effect on making a decision when it's time to make it at the time. You have to work on what you know at that time. And that's what I did, and I'm not sorry for it.
When you were speaking of the heavy artillerymen who were taken out and hanged afterwards, you favored the Nuremberg Trials.
Yes.
Any hindsight on those?
No, I haven't. I don't like to discuss them because they have to speak for themselves. But I endorsed what was done there. It had been set up before I became president, and I went through with it because I thought it was right.
But do you have a feeling that this may perhaps, in the big sweep of history, have been the beginning of the assignment of personal responsibility for atrocities rather than national responsibility?
It may have been. It may have been, and in all probability should be. Because there are certain rules of war that have been adopted a long time ago. I think they were adopted at Geneva, Switzerland, if I'm not mistaken. And they're supposed to be followed through by the men in command in the field. In this last war, under Hitler and under the other dictators, they paid no attention to those rules of war. And the very fact that Hitler willfully slaughtered the people that he did, Jews particularly, is one of the blots on the history of the world. And so that brought about the personal responsibility thing about which you're speaking, and I think it's a good thing.
Is it your feeling that national sovereignty over, again, the long period of history will tend to erode and there will be an increased unity?
I don't think the national sovereignty necessarily has to erode. The national sovereignty angle of this thing will eventually have to be worked out so that the United Nations, we'll say, can act to keep the peace in the world, just as the United States government acts to keep the peace in New York sometimes, or in California, or in Missouri. It's necessary sometimes for the federal government to have the power to sustain the peace. It's necessary, will be necessary for the international organization to be able to maintain the peace in the world just as we maintain it in these 48 republics that are states in the United States.
What I had in mind in asking the question was that at Potsdam you suggested the internationalization of a number of waterways.
Well, yes.
The Panama Canal, Suez, the Bosphorus, and so forth.
That is to keep the peace. That is to keep the peace because difficulties are founded on trade and finances in the long run. And if those waterways would allow the free transportation of merchandise except for the riparian rights and the cost of their upkeep, it would make it much easier to keep the peace in the world. Had that suggestion, this is another, I told you so, and I shouldn't say it, if that suggestion had been carried out, the Suez position would not have taken place as it is now.
I was about to say it was a rather prophetic suggestion, if you know. On the matter of the United Nations, we're in favor, I believe, of the Security Council having a veto.
Well, the Security Council veto was brought about for our own protection. We felt it was necessary. Of course, I didn't have any part in it, but it was explained to me by the President himself. The reason for it was that it was for our protection as well as for the protection of other people. But it was used by the Russians in a way that was never intended to be used as those things usually are, and sometime or other I rather think they'll amend it.
Is it your feeling that perhaps the Assembly should have greater power than it now has?
Yes.
In what direction, Mr. President?
Well, the House of Representatives has control of the purse strings, and that's a great thing for the representatives of the people to have. I don't know how they'd arrange this United Nations thing, for I haven't given it enough thought, and I'm not in a position to give you an outline of what ought to be done. But sometime or other we'll get this organization so it'll work for the purpose for which it is set up, and that's to keep the nations from going at each other's throats and causing another all-out war, which would be the destruction of civilization. We go back to become Neolithic, to the Neolithic age if we ever get into a war where we use these awful weapons that we have now.
When you announced the Point 4 program, you did it seemed to me, in a rather casual fashion. Did you expect it to grow and develop?
Yes, I did. I put a man in charge of it who understood it thoroughly and completely. His name was Dr. Barnett, and he was the head of Oklahoma A&M School. And he and I had talked the thing over at great length, that the proper thing to do was to teach these people how to help themselves. It was much more important than pouring money into the countries in wholesale lots, although we had to do that under the Marshall Plan to save the free world. But if you teach people to do things that will help them, they'll not only be your friend, but they'll help themselves to the point where they don't want to jump on anybody else, particularly if they have plenty to eat, plenty to wear. Oh, that's a cracker jack.
President, you spoke of attending the meetings of the Big Four. Who are the Big Four?
Well, the Big Four is made up of the Vice President and the Leader of the Majority in the Senate, and the Speaker and the Leader of the Majority in the House. All of the same political complexion as the President when the Congress is of his party, and of the opposite party when the Congress is not of his party. I had the Big Four meetings just the same with the 80th Congress as I had with the Democratic Congresses.
Do you believe that the practice of bipartisan consultation should be followed invariably?
Only in foreign affairs. I think it should be invariably followed in foreign affairs. But the President...
Speaking of General Marshall, his mission to China, do you have any hindsight or might have been comments on that?
Yes, I have, and I don't suppose I should express them. General Marshall did an excellent piece of work in China. His main difficulty was the lack of cooperation at home among shape in China with all sides apparently in agreement, and then they'd back out. That was particularly true of the communists as well as Chiang Kai-shek. And the effort that General Marshall made was almost successful. If it had been, China would have been a free country. But there's no use looking backwards, as I've told you a while ago. The thing did not work. The facts in the case are that we furnished Chiang Kai-shek with about $3.5 billion and equipment for 10 full divisions and half equipment for 10 more. And his generals surrendered all that equipment to the communists and 160 million rounds of ammunition, which the communists used to run him out of China. It was our equipment. They used some of that equipment in Korea also.
I remember very well. It was embarrassing to be in Korea and fired at by 105s and 155s with Chiang Kai-shek, and they were sold or given to the communists.
One or the other, maybe it was both, but they surrendered them anyway. And the Chinese communists got all the equipment, and Chiang had to leave China, and it's too bad.
You have spoken several times of General Marshall, both in his military and his diplomatic capacity. What is your estimate of him?
I think General Marshall is one of the greatest men of the age. He was not only an able military man and an able military planner, he's also a man of good common sense. And despite his military education and experience, he understands the political approach to things because he understands people. And he's one of the best judges of men that ever I saw. He showed that in the war.
Could this possibly be because he was not a West Pointer?
Well, now, you're getting into army politics, and I'd rather not go into that because I'm a National Guardsman and a little prejudiced against the regular army.
Mr. President, we were talking a little earlier about the situation in the Middle East. I began by talking about your immediate recognition of Israel. And I also suggested that some time ago in Kansas City you had a broad, imaginative, and bold concept of what might be done in the Middle East. Will you talk about that a little?
Yes, I'll be glad to give you my views on the subject. You see, the present civilization of our part of the world started. It's been my opinion since the Turkish Empire was broken up and these various countries were formed with supposedly free governments to find out a way where the food production could be increased in the Mesopotamian Valley, in Ethiopia, in Egypt, and that where the industrial section could begin with Italy and Greece and Israel. That soil is just the same as the black soil of Iowa and northern Illinois and North Missouri, and that could be made to produce food for 100 million people. It's only used for pasture land now. And that the Nile River can be harnessed in such a way, beginning way up at the top and making use of the water that goes to waste in the Mediterranean Sea, in the Sudan and in Egypt, to support anywhere from 20 to 25 million people. Israel can be made into an industrial state which will supply the industry for all these food-producing countries, and the
Mr. President, and that is that Israel's Arab neighbors must first of all admit that it is a viable state and it's going to stay there.
Of course, and it's going to stay there no matter what they think or what they do, because the Israelites will take care of themselves as they always did in historic times. But the thing is, I think eventually the thing will be worked out on a basis that will be for the welfare and benefit not only of themselves but for all the rest of the world too, because you see, with all that production of food right next door to them, a little further east, there's always a starvation situation with the 350 or 60 million people in India. And in China, it's the same situation. Those developments can be figured out in such a way that it will help the whole Far East and Near East as well as the rest of the world to get along.
But in order to achieve this, isn't it going to be necessary to have leadership and perhaps financing from the West?
Of course it is. It's going to be necessary to not only to have leadership and finance, but you've got to have a feeling of goodwill between the peoples themselves. Now, I don't know how you're going to cultivate that unless they read those sections of the two Testaments I was telling you about a while ago.
Speaking of reading, you've spoken often of reading history, Mr. President. How much time did you get to read history while you were in the White House?
I read myself to sleep every night. Well, the action that was taken. Should stay in the archives, and I think we'd better let the historians figure that out.
Right. Well, is the essential thing, let's make it on the presidency, since you know so much of the history. Is the important thing what the man brings to the presidency or what the presidency does to the man?
I think it's what the presidency does to the man. Of course, he must have the background, and he must know something about it and the history of it and its requirements and things of that sort. But it's like every other great office, from the man who's responsible for running a city or a county or a state. When he arrives at that point, if he has it in him, it does something to him and puts into him the effort and energy to make it a success. And most men come as, I won't say it to the presidency, I'll say most men, but Woodrow Wilson had a statement in which he said that a lot of people come to Washington and swell up. Those are the ones that have Potomac fever. A lot of people come to Washington, take jobs, and grow up with a job, and that's what most of our presidents have done. And the State Department, in my opinion, was Dean Acheson.
You have been quoted as saying that you never liked yes men around you.
I don't.
Did Acheson and Marshall argue with you?
Yes. Yes, indeed, and roughly sometimes. But when the decision was made, I never had any doubt but what their cooperation and loyalty would be just the same as if they hadn't argued with me. But I don't...
Is this one of the difficulties that American presidents have had, to be surrounded by people who agree with them too readily?
Yes. Yes, that's true. That happens, has happened in many a case. But a great many of the presidents discovered it in time and went ahead on their own. There were two or three who didn't have to discover it. There was Jefferson and old man Jackson and Abraham Lincoln, Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson. They knew where they were going. And
this is then, in your view, the essential for a president to have an objective and a direction.
that's right, and they fundamentally, basically, upright and honest and believe in what he's trying to do. And then you find men who help him put it over. He doesn't have any trouble with that when he's right.
What is the most common mistake of American presidents in many instances?
Well, that's a difficult one. That's the most difficult one. Every single president of the United States, from Washington to Eisenhower, I've had difficulties to face that sometimes there happened to be a precedent for some of them. Sometimes there did not happen to be a precedent, and they had to operate as best they could. And you'd have to take each administration individually and discover what the difficulties were, and then make up your mind, as with the schoolboy's afterthought, of what they should have done under certain circumstances. It's a long, long road to hoe.
All right. What was your greatest mistake, in hindsight?
Oh, I don't know exactly. There were, according to the best information I can get out of the press, there were so many of them they're hard to enumerate.
Do you still feel the seizure of Big Steel
I think it was,
a constitutional move?
I think it was correct and appropriate and a constitutional move, and if you read the minority opinion on that, you find that it's the law and always has been. And if you read the majority opinion, you find out that there is no opinion. There are just 7 or 8 opinions of 6 judges, and the opinion of the minority is right in line with the other opinions that have been rendered on the same subject.
Do you feel that perhaps your advocacy of civil rights may have been the prelude to the Supreme Court's decision?
No. I don't think anything I had done had anything to do with it. I think those judges, each one of them, had an idea that the court was now in a position to tell the president what he ought to do, and they better go ahead and do it.
I'm older than
undoubtedly was an emergency. The President has the right not only to exercise the powers delegated to him in the Constitution, but all those that are not prohibited to him by the Constitution. And I follow that procedure, as have the presidents before me, from Jefferson on down.
When did Jefferson do it?
He bought Louisiana. Jefferson stretched the Constitution till it cracked when he bought Louisiana, and I don't think anybody would want to give it back to France.
Well, then you believe that historians and perhaps future Supreme Courts will agree that you were right.
I'm sure of it.
What about tideland oil?
Well, there is no tideland oil. You know, tidelands is a misnomer. The tidelands of the United States are the distance from high tide to low tide. That's all the tidelands there are, and that belongs to the states. The offshore oil lands belong to the United States of America. In 1945, I issued an executive order laying claim to all the mineral rights in the fisheries out as far as the continental shelf and all the oceans, for the reason that I wanted to protect the rights of the United States in those waters. And in order to protect those rights, we have to have the wherewithal to make that protection stand, and that consists of the Navy of the United States. I don't know of a single state in the Union that has a Navy that can protect the 3-mile limit below low tide.
Where did you want those oil lands for the nation as a whole?
I wanted them for the whole United States because they belong to the whole United States. The United States as a whole protects them. And the interior states have just as much right to that offshore oil as have the border states. And I vetoed 2 bills and prevented that, and also was of the opinion that the Supreme Court's opinion on the subject, twice expressed, was the correct one. That's one time when I agreed fully with the Supreme Court.
You agree fully with the Supreme Court on the matter of segregation in the schools?
Yes, I do. I think probably that is brought about by the education of the people on the necessity for equal opportunity in this great country of ours if we're going to be leaders of the free world. I think those men acted on that from conviction. It was unanimous.
And what consequences do you think will flow from that?
I think eventually the court's decision will be implemented. I don't know whether you remembered or not, but the amendments to the Constitution of the United States, which guaranteed civil rights, have been on the books ever since 1868 or 69, and they're just now beginning to be implemented.
And you think that in due course, how long do you think it will take before it is implemented?
Well, it's a matter of education, as we were talking about a while ago. I think the more education the people have, and the better they understand the situation and what it means in world affairs, the easier it'll be to carry it through.
You said in the 1948 campaign that you were quite prepared to it's unpredictable, and no one can tell in advance.
That's right. That's what makes a free country great. A man has a right to consider things as long as he likes, make up his own mind, and do as he pleases when he gets in that voting booth, and that's what makes a free country.
At what time in the 1948 campaign did you think you had it won?
I thought I had the 1948 campaign won at the convention in Philadelphia.
Why was that?
For the simple reason that the treatment of Senator Barkley and myself in our acceptance speeches at that convention showed me that the people could be convinced. And I left that convention fully of the opinion that if I could see enough people, I'd win that election, and that's what happened. And I wasn't being egotistical about it because I'd been through a half a dozen campaigns before that on the same basis, where I didn't have a Chinaman's chance and won the election.
And you really haven't very much confidence in these new electronic gadgets like radio and television. You still think if you can see enough people face to face and talk to them, that's the way to win.
There's no question about that. Personal contact in a voting campaign is essential when a fellow has a strong and powerful opposition. I might tell you a story about Chinaman's chance, incidentally, while we were there. I didn't want to insult the Chinaman because I have a great respect for the Chinese people. We were coming back from Rio de Janeiro and crossed the